Hello, everybody, and welcome back to You Exchange, the podcast where I exchange my user experiences to change them, and yours for the better. I'm Jeremy, a mentor and senior user researcher with over 8 years of experience and a background in neuroscience. Throughout my career, I've had the privilege of engaging with hundreds of users around the world. I've created this podcast with the aim of providing my mentorship and educational content, offering actionable tips, knowledge, and guidance in the realm of research to anyone having an interest in this area. And I hope that you will find this episode insightful. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Happy to be back. And today, I will start this second episode dedicated to storytelling. If you have not listened to the first episode, that's where I cover a bit of my story when it comes to storytelling, my experience of it or lack thereof, how I sucked at it in the past, and how I suck a little bit less now, what you can learn from my failures, and also some techniques, tools, and tips when it comes to storytelling and at least making your presentation resonate more with the audience. In today's episode, the goal is that I will cover story arcs more in detail. And for me, this is a fascinating topic because, as you might know already by now, by listening to me, you know how I love frameworks. Frameworks are amazing because frameworks give you a point of reference and it allows you to feel a little bit less lost. And I discovered there are frameworks for absolutely everything and anything. So when I discovered there were frameworks for storytelling and presenting something, I was amazed. And these frameworks, I want to tell you about them right now, as I discovered them and as I applied them in my previous presentations. Again, this might focus a little bit on user experience research because this is my area, but you can totally translate that to your field and apply these insights and recommendations to your area of expertise. So, let's start right in. Story arcs are a framework that you can apply to structure your story. It says it's an arc, let's say, because usually when we present something, as I said in the previous episode, we have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And usually, but not always, stories start with kind of the context at the beginning, setting the stage, and then at the middle, we have the climax, or let's say the most important part, and at the end, we have the resolution. And this is oftentimes what happens in pretty much all the movies and cartoons. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes. But we can all relate to this kind of story arc where you have the main character going through something. At the very beginning, he's kind of chilled, and then something happens, and then the character will have to fight against it, or find his or her way in the middle of this mess, let's say. And then at the end, the character triumphs, or not, but in the end, everything, let's say, gets sorted out one way or another. And everyone gets kind of, everyone grew through this experience, let's say. So that's the idea. It's called an arc because it visually is represented by an arc with a lower point, and then it goes up because it's the climax, it, I would say it depicts kind of the intensity of the story or the emotions you want to communicate. So you start at kind of a baseline, a neutral point, and then you go right up to some point which would be the climax, the moment when the story is at its most important stage, and then it would fall again to another point in which it's the resolution. So we could see that as the activation that you go through when you listen to a story or when you watch a movie, the activation being the arousal. So you have way less emotions at the moment of setting up the stage and at the moment when there is some resolution. So we can all think about a movie in which, or a book that we read in which at the beginning it's so boring because there is a lot of descriptions. At least I feel a little bit this way when I read some books, and some of them are way too descriptive at the beginning. But that hopefully can illustrate what I'm saying about this evolution in terms of arousal. And so that's why it's called an arc. And so basically it's the path that your story would take. And we have many types of arcs. For instance, in user experience research, we have kind of a different style of arc. Well, yes and no. So usually what we do is we present the context first, being the background, challenges, research questions. Why did you start this project and what were you expecting to get out of it? And then you go straight to the insights and recommendations, which would be your climax. But it happens pretty quickly. And so that's why we mention oftentimes that UX research storytelling is kind of answers first and then explanation. Whereas when we try to make the parallel with other types of arc, we could imagine that we spend maybe a longer time in setting up the stage and, yes, setting up the context basically before the climax. But in kind of business presentations and any presentation in a professional context, usually executives, for instance, or other stakeholders that are, for instance, more business oriented, will have less time to listen to all the background and the context before you introduce the results and the insights. And so that's why we have this kind of arc in user experience research, but that's one type of arc and you don't need to follow it all. And by the way, everything that I'm saying, as always, is just my experience and my perspective of things and how I learned them over time. It's absolutely not a recipe you need to follow. Always consider your situation, what works, what doesn't. And by the way, give me feedback if something works in another way that what I described. So that's one type of arc in user experience research, starting with an executive summary of findings and recommendations, and then you back up each and every point with evidence. So the message here, if you should remember at least one thing, is that there are many types of story arcs, and there are many you can choose from. But it's important in general to have in mind that there are some basics to each story arc: the beginning, the middle, and the end. So we can synthesize story arcs in some kind of ways in UX research. I wanted to share that with you in case you did several projects, in case you did several researches. We could imagine that we could map these story arcs depending on what you learned if you have to present several projects all at once. So, for instance, the first act, which would be the setup or setting the stage, we could imagine that it would be about understanding the background. So it's when you would have done some foundational research, generative discovery research. You would identify who are the users, what are their problems, what did you learn about them, So basically, the methodologies here would be more interviews, diary studies, contextual inquiries, and so on. And then you would have another act, which would be the act two for those who are interested in theater. The act two, which would be the conflict, it would be more about, okay, now that we know what our users needs, how do our products qualify against those needs? So in terms of usability, in terms of matching expectations and so on. So here in the act two, it would be more studies related to, as I said, usability. It can be tree testing, it could be any kind of evaluative study. And so that would be more or less this kind of progression in user experience research if you have several projects to present. But it can be the same thing in other areas. For instance, you can imagine if you do marketing, you can imagine, oh, we have a marketing campaign we want to test, but first we had a first project in which we did market discovery, market research to gauge a bit the needs of our population, let's say. So there's that. And then you would have another kind of project in which, okay, now that we know what is the landscape, we will apply our strategy and then we will gauge the results. So that would be act two. And then when you have to present both, you would start, of course, by the first one, in which you try to understand better the landscape. That's an example, and I wanted to share first one type of, let's say, story arc in which you have several types of projects. And then I wanted to make a small parenthesis regarding one type of storytelling technique that is really, really efficient and that would work whatever the story arc you choose. So you need to conceptualize it this way. We have story arcs. Story arcs is just a way for you to structure your presentation with the beginning, middle, and end. But that's one part of the thing, of the presentation. But then you have other, let's say, assets you have at your disposal to make an impactful presentation. And among them, we have what I said about visual elements. It can be diagrams, it can be videos, quotes, and so on. So that's one thing. I already covered them, and I will cover them again, but that's the idea. And you can also use some storytelling techniques, as I shared in the past, that I would consider like a side technique and a side tool. So you have the story arc, and on top of that, you can superimpose other techniques. So everything can be combined to get at a point in which you're having a very impactful presentation. So imagine you use already a story arc, and on top of that, you use this tool that I'm about to talk, which is comparisons. No matter what story arc you choose, consider always including comparisons. So you would include what is and what it could be. And this applies to any field. What is the current situation? In any field, we could identify easily a problem. It's fairly easy. Imagine you're an entrepreneur and you want to develop a product. So if you want to pitch your idea, your startup idea, to some investor, you have to tell them, okay, here is the landscape. Here is the actual problem. And here is the future state. What could it be? And so you perpetually put them in front of one in front of the other, let's say, and you oppose them. You create tension, and that's really important. And so the idea, the key aspect here is to maintain dynamic tension between what is and what it could be throughout the whole presentation. And even if you use some story arcs, you could still use that. So for instance, when you set up the context, you could say, this is the current situation with our users. Okay, it would be best if it would be this way. Then stage 2, you would talk about the conflict. Okay, how did it perform, the tool that you used? Okay, great, not great, good, not so good. Okay, here is what it could be in the future. And then you move on to the actual future state. So this is something you can use superimposed on top of your actual story arc. So now diving a little bit deeper into a typical story arc for user experience research. So in the first stage, in the first part, Act 1, you would actually meet the protagonists. So the actual users and the antagonists, the problems that affect your users. And so that would be the beginning of a plot. One acquaintance of mine once said, and this is not my term, but once said, it's the movie trailer. And that is actually good. It would be like setting the stage with some spice at the end, and I will talk about it right after, is the beginning of Act 2, but that would be kind of the movie trailer, basically. And so here you map it to some methodologies like diary studies, surveys, interviews, what you used in the past to understand better your users. And then in Act number 2, when you're doing user experience research at least, you would expose the core of your findings, and you would put the most important slide at the beginning. So the summary slide, you place it at the beginning because this is the most important one. And so that would also allow you, for several reasons, to be more impactful. The first one is that this is indisputable. If you put that first, this is indisputable. Whereas if you show the process through which you arrived at this conclusion, at each step of the way, someone can have a question and someone can disagree with what you're saying, even though you have data on this to support this. So that's one reason. And then, of course, it's a matter of not boring your audience. And so put the most important information at this stage. And that is what the person I know said, this is the movie trailer, because this is why we want to stay for the movie, because we saw a trailer and it appealed to us, and so in the trailer the directors chose to put, let's say, the spiciest moments. And so here you would put some conflict and tension between the actual protagonists and the problems, challenges that they overcame. You can talk about usability testing, heuristic evaluation, usability finding reports, and so on and so forth. And in the Act 3, you would mention that the protagonist triumph and there is a better future ahead. And so for that, you could share basically your recommendations, future state, some mention of users' expectations for the future, and so on and so forth. So that's it for the user experience style, presentation, and storytelling and story arc. And then I can move on to, let's say, the most basic structures and examples of story arcs. So in any kind of situation, as you might have understood, you have the beginning, you set up the situation. In the middle, you present some contrasts and possibilities. And then at the end, you show some call to action and future vision. By the way, the call to action is very important. Never ever let your listeners and your audience hanging with some, okay, these are the results. No, you should prepare the work for them so that either they agree or disagree, at least some of the work is done and the thought process is done by you. And so then it's only a matter of building on top of that. Whereas if you don't do that, there is a high probability that your insights will go unused. So now diving deeper a little bit. At the beginning, you should always start by describing the status quo. What is currently the situation? And create contrast with what it could be, as I said. And use this gap to produce some tension. In the middle, you would follow up with that, and even more if you actually tested something and you show how it could be and how it performed, and repeat that several times. And then at the end, you would list action items, but not only, you would list an inspiring call to action and describe a new bliss, what is called a new bliss, which is like an ideal future state. And by that, you should, of course, mention to your stakeholders how does that translate in terms of business metrics and in terms of needs. Sometimes this is, let's say, more relatable for them. And so you would show them that you actually have recommendations for the future, but these recommendations, if implemented, they would actually help the business, and so they are interested in them. So they are interested in listening to you. And now let me give you some examples of story arcs. So the ones I like really much, as I said in the previous episode, are the Pixar Story Spine, then you have the South Park Story Spine, and you have the Hero Journey. I'm myself more familiar with the Hero Journey and the Pixar Story Spine. However, I see also the value in the South Park one. So the Pixar Story Spine actually is kind of a template that they use and that you can use at any scale for your presentation. It can be summarizing one presentation and a list of findings in one sentence. But it can also be an outline for your presentation. As I said in the previous episode, it would go with something along the lines of someday XYZ, introduce character, what's happening, setting up the stage, and so on. Every day, XYZ, what is happening again, what are the behaviors, what are the habits, what are the pain points, until one day, and here starts, as I said, and that's why I emphasize so much in the previous minutes about these aspects of beginning, middle, and end. So until one day, here you have the climax, the most important part of the story. Something happens, and then character reaction to this something happening, and then you can have the conclusion. I don't remember exactly how it is, but it's something like, and now, since then, blah blah blah. And I gave you some examples in the previous episode, but I can give you one sneak peek that I have one example that came to my mind right now, which is about a patent I developed. So, and I will make an episode dedicated to it. If you're interested in knowing how you can write a patent, I can make an episode on this. Anyway, so it would be something like, one day, our guest was thinking about an optimal way for, let's say, easing or making the use of the car more pleasant for passengers and for drivers. Every day he was looking for solutions and ideas, until one day he made a project on emotions, affective states, and emotions and affective states, basically. Since then, he applied all this knowledge and ideated with engineers, developers, designers, and the whole team to come up with solutions. And now we have an actual patent on the topic to come up with solutions for drivers to use their car in the most, let's say, intuitive way while they are driving. So I cannot say more about this right now, but this is an actual patent. It's published, and I will cover that in an upcoming episode. Anyway, so that's an example of the Pixar Story Spine. Then we have the South Park Story Spine. I don't know much about this, but I just know that it's two conflicting truths that exist to create tension that drives the story. I already talked about the tension, so you can understand. But here it's really about creating two truths. And so we can easily conceptualize this with the product team that wants to develop something without thinking about user needs. And so we have the business needs and we have the user needs, and that creates tension. So what can we do about this? And finally, we have the hero journey, which is, as I said, one of the most common ones. And so we have an actual evolution with first the ordinary world, which is something that describes the current experience that starts. It's like setting up the stage, as I said several times. Then we have the call to adventure. We explain why change is needed. So why, for instance, we redesigned our e-commerce front page because, well, it was kind of boring and we were losing customers, imagine. And then we could talk about challenges and trials. So here you should present user pain points and obstacles. So you could say, for instance, yeah, we redesigned, it's already better, but these were the XYZ pain points felt by our customers. Then we would have the transformation. What are the actual recommendations to improve the user experience? We would have then the return to illustrate potential positive outcomes of implementing the changes. And that's the hero journey, basically. So as you might have understood by now, a basic arc includes 3 C's: context, climax, and conclusion. And so this involves the fact of creating a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end to ensure that it's easy to follow and understand. So some additional tips to dive a little bit deeper, and that can apply to pretty much anyone. When you set up the context, you would start by setting the stage for your project, for instance, the current state of the business or the product, outline some research goals and objectives, for instance, provide some background regarding why the research was conducted or why the project was conducted in the first hand. You can also talk about the personas, characters. You can give them some names, some brief backstories, describe goals, motivations. All that will help to humanize a bit the presentation, basically. Then you would also introduce some methodologies and activities. What did you do as methods and why? What was your approach? It doesn't need to be research methods if you're not a researcher, but it can be what was your approach and why. That will help you, let's say, be more trusted by your stakeholders for transparency reasons, but also because you're sharing your expertise and that it's not something you came up with without any reason. Then we will move on to the second stage, in which there is the conflict and the climax. And here it will be the bulk of the insights or the information you want to share. This needs to be concise, memorable, and complete. This is an assertion. You don't need to be with sentences like might or could. You need to be sharing the truth here. And so here, some questions that you might ask yourself to be able to triage a bit your insights and recommendations is like, what did you find most interesting and compelling about this story? What were 3 to 5 things that you would remember most? What do you feel in your gut and your intuition about what you want to share, basically? Describe some obstacles, tension, as I said already, contradiction between the user needs and the business. Create tension, basically. And also visually, avoid at this time to show some dense paragraphs and long texts. Use really a few amount of text in your slides and share only one idea per slide. Try to focus on only one idea. That's really difficult, but it will be way easier to have more slides with one idea per slide, because it helps people to focus with what they can see on the screen. Use also some artifacts to help you communicate your ideas. And this can be quotes, observation, videos. We also should think, of course, of the resolution. And so the resolution is about stating again all the insights and findings. And by the way, as I said multiple times, you should have them at the very beginning as well. You can use data visualizations, quotes, and anecdotes to support your points. However, it would have been done earlier the better. Explain then all of these implications of the findings for the product or the business. And so you explain the implications with giving recommendations. You suggest some design changes. You also can propose some follow-up research or validation studies. And you could also expose what I like to give is next steps. So, as I said, follow-up research studies or other projects, but you can also share several ideas for next steps. So it can be something like by steps. So first we would do this first project, and then we would do this. What do you think about this? It's really meant to be a discussion at this point, because you might not have all the elements taken into consideration. So you need the opinions of everyone around the table. And so you can also include, to end, some reflection about your process. What went right? What went wrong? What could you have improved? What can be some areas for future exploration? And that would be it. You would end, of course, with providing a vision for the future. What could be the product if we implement your recommendations? And here you can, of course, again and again make use of the before versus after comparisons. So, in a nutshell, that would be it for the story arcs. I think I made my point across with the story arc and the evolution. I repeated several times, but that's because I think there are many angles to that depending on your profession, first of all. Then there are many different story arcs and ways to do it. Also, it's a difficult topic. I would have loved, when I learned about this, to have someone repeating this topic to me. And so, as this is something that I couldn't find, hopefully that is something that you learned today. And if it's the case, as always, leave me a review, subscribe, share it with your friends and colleagues. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next episode. Until then, take care. Bye-bye. And that's it for today's episode. Thank you everyone for joining me today on New Exchange. I hope you found today's episode insightful and valuable. Make sure to subscribe in order for you not to miss the next episode. Share it if you liked it, and leave a review. Thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics, feel free to reach out directly to me. You can find all the details in the show notes. And see you in the next episode. Bye-bye. And